My name is Alina Marsh. I'm 34 years old. And the night I stood in the hallway outside my mother-in-law's study, listening to my husband whisper 5 words I was never supposed to hear, was the night I finally understood that the tremor in my hands for the past 2 months had never been stress. After tonight, she won't be a problem anymore. Julian's voice, low, almost tender, the same voice he used when he told me he loved me. I pressed my back against the wall beside the half-open door, my phone already rising toward my ear as though I were mid-conversation with someone else. A habit I'd developed without realizing it, the quiet instinct of a person whose body understands danger before her mind fully catches up. Through the gap in the door, I could see my mother-in-law, Vivian, seated at her writing desk, a small glass vial between her fingers, turning it slowly in the lamplight the way you might examine something you were deciding whether to be proud of. "You're certain the dosage won't show on a standard panel," Julian said. Vivian's answer came without hesitation, the calm, practiced tone of a woman who had clearly rehearsed this conversation more than once. "Not unless someone specifically knows to look for it. And by the time anyone thinks to look, Alina will already be exactly the kind of unreliable the guardianship petition needs her to be." I did not gasp. I did not drop my phone. Some instinct, older and steadier than panic, told me that whatever was happening in that study had already been happening for weeks, and that the only advantage I still possessed was that they did not yet know I knew. I pressed record on my phone, slid it silently back into my cardigan pocket, and walked, calmly, back toward the guest bathroom down the hall, my heart slamming against my ribs the entire way. I had married Julian Marsh 6 years earlier, in a small ceremony overlooking the Hudson that his mother, Vivian, had quietly reorganized twice before the actual date, each time citing some detail about the seating arrangement that needed correcting. I understood, even then, that Vivian's involvement in her son's life had a particular density to it, the kind of maternal presence that other people described diplomatically as devoted, and that I had, in private, occasionally described to my sister as suffocating. Julian had been charming in the specific, practiced way of men raised by mothers who never let anything about them go unpolished, attentive at dinner parties, quick with a compliment, genuinely funny when he wanted to be. For the first 3 years of our marriage, I believed, the way people believe things they desperately want to be true, that Vivian's intensity was simply the residue of losing her husband young and raising Julian mostly alone. I did not yet understand that intensity and calculation can wear identical faces at a family dinner table. I should have paid closer attention to a story Julian told me himself, early in our marriage, meant as an affectionate anecdote about his mother's resourcefulness rather than a warning. He told me that after his father died, a dispute had arisen with a business partner over the division of his father's shipping brokerage. A dispute that dragged through informal negotiations for nearly a year until the partner, a man named Edmund Castellano, suddenly and unexpectedly agreed to sign away his claim entirely, walking away with a fraction of what he had originally demanded. Julian told this story with visible pride, describing his mother as brilliant, someone who simply understood, better than anyone else in the family, how to make problems resolve themselves in her favor. He never explained exactly what had changed Edmund Castellano's mind so abruptly, and at the time, newly married and eager to see the best in my husband's family, I never thought to ask. I think about that story often now, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you once walked past without noticing what was underneath it, wondering exactly how many problems in Vivian Marsh's life had resolved themselves in her favor over the decades, and exactly how many of those resolutions had involved something considerably more deliberate than luck. My father, Thomas Calloway, had built Calloway Textile Group from a single mill in upstate New York into a company employing over 600 people across 3 states before he died of a heart attack 4 years into my marriage, leaving me, his only child, as sole heir to both the company and a family trust valued. According to the estate documents I had barely glanced at during the worst weeks of my grief, at just under $31 million. I had never wanted to run the company day to day, and had instead hired a capable CEO, a longtime family friend named Rosalind Farrow, to manage operations while I retained controlling ownership and a seat on the board. Julian, who had spent most of his adult life working in a mid-level role at a private equity firm that never seemed to promote him as quickly as he believed he deserved, had grown visibly more interested in Callaway Textile Group's operations in the 2 years following my father's death, offering unsolicited opinions during board dinners, gently suggesting that I consider giving him formal decision-making authority since, as he put it, marriage meant we were already partners in everything else. I had resisted, gently at first, then more firmly, not because I doubted his intentions outright, but because some instinct, the same instinct that would later save my life, told me that authority over $31 million was not something to hand over simply because someone asked nicely enough times. I remember one dinner in particular, perhaps 8 months before that night outside Vivian's study, when Julian raised the subject with unusual directness. We were sitting in our own kitchen, not Vivian's, just the two of us, and he set down his fork and told me he had been thinking about what would happen to Callaway Textile Group if something ever happened to me. The way he phrased it deliberately vague. Something ever happened, rather than numbing any specific fear. He suggested, gently, that we consider updating our estate documents to grant him broader financial power of attorney, purely as a precaution. He said, purely because marriage meant we should trust each other completely with exactly this kind of contingency planning. I remember feeling a small, cold flicker of unease at the phrase purely as a precaution, though I dismissed it at the time as ordinary anxiety about mortality that many couples our age begin experiencing once a parent has died young. I told him I would think about it, and I did think about it, for months, always circling back to the same quiet, stubborn resistance I couldn't fully articulate even to myself. The sense that handing over that particular kind of authority felt less like an act of trust, and more like handing someone a key to a door I hadn't yet decided needed unlocking. I did not know, sitting at that kitchen table, that the conversation I was gently declining to have was, in a sense, a preview of the argument my recorded voice would later need to win in a courtroom instead. The symptoms had begun roughly 10 weeks before that night in the hallway, subtle at first, the kind of thing I dismissed as exhaustion or stress from a difficult quarter at the company. Tremors in my hands, faint but persistent, usually worse in the evenings. Occasional confusion, moments where I would walk into a room and briefly forget why, a sensation I told myself was simply the fog of being overworked. Headaches that arrived with a strange metallic taste I couldn't quite place. My internist, Dr. Whitfield, had run a standard blood panel after I mentioned the tremors during a routine visit, found nothing definitively abnormal, and suggested I consider reducing stress and perhaps consulting a neurologist if the symptoms persisted. I remember Julian, sitting beside me during that appointment, nodding with visible concern, suggesting gently that perhaps I should take a step back from board responsibilities at Callaway Textile Group until we understood what was happening with my health, a suggestion that had sounded, at the time, like love. It sounded very different once I understood what I was actually hearing that night outside Vivian's study. 2 weeks before that night outside Vivian's study, I had come dangerously close to agreeing to exactly the arrangement Julian and Vivian needed. Exhausted, frightened by my own worsening symptoms, and genuinely uncertain whether stress or something more serious was responsible, I told Julian one evening that perhaps he was right. Perhaps I should temporarily step back from my board responsibilities and let him take on a more formal role managing our household finances until we understood what was happening with my health. I remember the specific quality of his relief in that moment, a relief that struck me even then as slightly too complete, too immediate, though I attributed it, generously, to simple concern for my well-being rather than anything more calculated. It was only Marguerite, calling the following morning for our usual weekly check-in, who talked me out of signing anything so quickly, telling me, with the particular bluntness only a sister can deploy without causing offense, that no responsible attorney would ever advise transferring significant financial authority based on undiagnosed symptoms without first exhausting every possible medical explanation, and that if Julian truly only wanted to help, he could do so without requiring legal authority over my finances in order to bring me a cup of tea or drive me to an appointment. I delayed signing anything, telling Julian I wanted to wait for the neurologist referral first. Looking back, that single week of delay, prompted by nothing more than my sister's habitual skepticism, may have been the only thing standing between me and a guardianship transfer completed voluntarily, before I ever had reason to suspect it wasn't simply born of love. I spent the 20 minutes after that overheard conversation locked in the guest bathroom, sitting on the edge of the tub, forcing my breathing into something steady enough to function on. I did not confront anyone that night. I understood, with a clarity that surprised me given how violently my hands were shaking, that walking back into that dinner and accusing my husband and his mother of poisoning me would accomplish nothing except giving them time to become more careful. Instead, I rejoined the dinner table with a headache I claimed was migraine-related, declined the tea Vivian offered me with her usual warm insistence, citing nausea, and watched, with a new and terrible attentiveness, the way Vivian's expression flickered, almost imperceptibly when I pushed the cup aside untouched. I drove home separately from Julian that night, telling him I needed to stop by my office to review a contract before the following morning's board meeting, and instead drove 40 minutes to my sister Marguerite's apartment in the city, arriving just after 11 with a recording on my phone that I still could not fully believe I had captured. Marguerite, a corporate litigator who had spent the better part of a decade cross-examining people far more composed than Vivian Marsh, listened to the recording twice without speaking, her face going progressively paler with each replay. "Alina," she said finally, "you need to leave that house tonight, and you need to see a doctor who has no relationship whatsoever to Julian or his family, immediately." I told her about the tremors, the confusion, the metallic taste, the blood panel that had come back inconclusive, and watched her expression shift from horror into something colder and more focused, the specific look she wore, I imagined, right before she destroyed a hostile witness in a deposition. "That's not a standard toxicology panel," she said. "If Vivian said the dosage wouldn't show on a standard panel, that tells us two things. First, she has enough knowledge to know exactly what a standard panel screens for. Second, whatever she's using is something specific enough that it requires someone to know to look for it." She was already reaching for her phone as she spoke. "I know a toxicologist. We're going to get you tested properly, tonight if we can manage it, tomorrow morning at the absolute latest." Dr. Priya Anand, a forensic toxicologist Marguerite had worked with on a previous case involving a contested inheritance, agreed to see me at 7 the following morning at a private lab in the city, well outside the network of physicians connected to Julian's family through decades of country club memberships and charity board overlaps. She drew blood, collected a hair sample, and asked detailed questions about every symptom, every timeline, every meal or beverage I could remember accepting specifically from Vivian over the preceding months. When I mentioned that Vivian had, for the past several months, taken to personally preparing a particular evening tea for me during our weekly Sunday dinners, insisting it was a family recipe passed down from her own mother, good for digestion and calming the nerves, Dr. Annan's expression sharpened in a way that made my stomach drop entirely. "I want you to bring me a sample of that tea if you can get one without anyone noticing," she said. "And Alina, I need you to understand something important. Hair sample analysis can detect certain toxic exposures going back months, sometimes longer, because hair grows at a predictable rate and can preserve a timeline of what's passed through your system. If someone has been doozing you gradually, we may be able to see exactly when it started." The results came back 4 days later, and Dr. Anand asked to meet with both Marguerite and me in person rather than delivering the findings over the phone, which told me, before she said a single word, that whatever she had found was serious enough to require a room rather than a phone call. She sat across from us in a small consultation office, a folder open on the desk between us, and explained, in careful, measured language, that my hair sample showed elevated levels of thallium, a heavy metal historically used. She noted grimly, in rat poison formulations decades ago before most countries banned its consumer use, specifically because of how difficult it was to detect, and how effectively it mimicked the symptoms of neurological and psychiatric decline, tremors, confusion, hallucinations in higher doses, memory disturbances, exactly the kind of presentation that, left unexplained long enough, could easily be mistaken by an unfamiliar physician for early-onset dementia or a psychiatric breakdown. The timeline in my hair sample showed exposure beginning approximately 10 weeks earlier, correlating almost exactly with the onset of my first symptoms, and continuing in what Dr. Anand described as a slow, escalating pattern consistent with someone gradually increasing dosage over time. "Someone has been poisoning you for months," she said, and even though I had already suspected exactly this sitting in that guest bathroom 4 days earlier, hearing it confirmed with clinical, undeniable precision felt like the floor of my entire life quietly giving way beneath me. Marguerite moved with the specific, controlled urgency of someone who had spent her career preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Within the same week, she connected me with a criminal attorney, Devin Ockaffer, who specialized in cases involving domestic poisoning and elder abuse. Though in this case, I supposed, spousal and financial abuse would be the more accurate description. Devin reviewed the recording, the toxicology report, and the timeline of Julian's escalating interest in Callaway Textile Group's governance, and told us, with the calm gravity of someone who had seen this pattern before, that what we were looking at was very likely a coordinated plan to establish a medical basis for a guardianship petition, using my declining health, engineered rather than natural, to argue that I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs, at which point Julian, as my spouse, would be the most logical candidate to assume control of both my personal finances and my seat on Callaway Textile Group's board. "The recording alone is significant," Devin said, "but Vivian's specific language about the dosage not appearing on a standard panel suggests premeditation and specialized knowledge, which strengthens any eventual criminal case considerably. We need more evidence before we move, though. If we act too soon, they'll simply claim the conversation was about something else entirely, medication for one of Vivian's own ailments, anything vague enough to muddy the recording's meaning." Over the following 3 weeks, I lived a version of my life that felt almost unbearably strange, continuing to attend Sunday dinners at Vivian's house, continuing to accept the tea she prepared, now discreetly transferring it into a small collection vial I kept hidden in my cardigan pocket rather than drinking it, pouring the remainder down the guest bathroom's sink when no one was watching. Dr. Anand tested 3 separate samples over those weeks, each one confirming thallium at levels consistent with continued, deliberate dosing, evidence that would eventually prove critical because it demonstrated the poisoning was ongoing and active rather than a single historical incident. I forced myself to behave, at every dinner, exactly as someone genuinely experiencing worsening symptoms might behave, allowing small, exaggerated moments of confusion, occasionally letting my hands tremble more visibly than necessary. Watching Vivian's expression each time with an attentiveness that felt almost unbearable to maintain, while smiling and thanking her for the tea. Julian, during those weeks, began gently raising the subject of a formal medical evaluation with increasing frequency, mentioning, almost casually, that a colleague of his had recommended an excellent neuropsychiatric specialist who could help us understand what was happening. Someone I would later learn, through Devin's investigation, had a documented history of testifying favorably in guardianship proceedings for families willing to compensate him generously for his professional opinion. One of those Sunday dinners nearly ended everything before we had gathered enough evidence to move safely. Vivian, pouring the tea as always, lingered a moment too long beside my chair, and when I reached for the cup with what I hoped looked like ordinary, if slightly unsteady, hands, she asked, almost idly, whether I had noticed the tea tasted different lately, whether perhaps my sense of taste was changing along with everything else. I understood, in that instant, that she was testing me, gauging whether I had begun to suspect anything, and I made myself smile and say that everything tasted a little strange these days, which was, in its own way, the truest thing I said at that entire table. Later that night, transferring the tea into my collection vial in the guest bathroom with the water running to cover any sound, I heard footsteps stop directly outside the door, pausing for 3, 4, 5 long seconds before continuing down the hallway. I never learned whether it had been Julian or Vivian, or simply someone passing by entirely unrelated to my fear. But I sat on the edge of that tub afterward for nearly 10 minutes before I trusted my hands enough to open the door, understanding, with a clarity that still unsettles me, exactly how easily those 3 weeks of careful evidence gathering could have ended not in a courtroom victory, but in whatever quieter, more permanent solution Vivian might have chosen if she had realized, even a day earlier than she did, that I already knew. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not one I orchestrated dramatically. It arrived instead through a document, delivered by process server to our house on a Tuesday afternoon while I was home alone. A petition filed in probate court requesting the establishment of a limited guardianship over my financial affairs, citing, in careful clinical language prepared by an attorney I recognized as one Julian's family had used for decades, a documented pattern of cognitive decline including memory impairment, tremor, and episodes of confusion that, the petition argued, rendered me increasingly unable to manage the complex financial responsibilities associated with Callaway Textile Group and the Callaway Family Trust. The petition proposed Julian as guardian, citing his spousal relationship, and the document noted almost tenderly his demonstrated devotion to my well-being throughout what it described as a difficult period of declining health. I read that petition standing in our foyer with my hands actually shaking now, not from thallium, but from a fury so complete it felt almost like calm, and I understood that whatever patience Devin had asked me to maintain over the preceding 3 weeks had just run out entirely. Before calling Devin, I did something I hadn't planned and would later question, though I have never fully regretted it. I called Julian directly, standing in that foyer with the petition still trembling in my other hand, and when he answered, his voice carried the same careful, concerned warmth he had used at every doctor's appointment for the past 2 months. "Elena, are you all right?" He said, and I asked him, without preamble, whether he had really believed I would simply sign away control of my father's company without a fight. There was a pause, brief but unmistakable, the specific pause of someone recalculating in real time. "This isn't about fighting," he said. "This is about getting you the help you need." I asked him what exactly he thought was wrong with me. Another pause. "The doctors will figure that out," he said, which was, I realized then, the answer of a man who already knew precisely what was wrong with me and precisely who had caused it. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, "tell me what your mother put in the tea." The silence that followed lasted long enough that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear to check the call hadn't dropped. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally, but something in his voice had changed entirely. The warmth gone, replaced by something flatter and more careful. The voice of a man realizing the ground beneath an entire plan had just shifted without warning. I hung up without saying anything else, because I understood, with total clarity, that I had just given away exactly one piece of information I probably shouldn't have, that I knew something was in the tea, but that the same call had also given me something more valuable, the unmistakable, recorded sound of my husband failing to deny it. I called Devin immediately, and within 2 hours, sitting in his office with Marguerite beside me, we assembled the response that would end in a single filing, whatever plan Julian and Vivian believed they were still quietly executing. Devin's counter-petition included the full toxicology timeline from Dr. Anand, 3 independently tested tea samples confirming ongoing thallium exposure, and the recording from that night outside Vivian's study, authenticated and transcribed by a forensic audio specialist to eliminate any argument that the conversation had been edited or taken out of context. The counter-petition requested not a guardianship over me, but an emergency protective order against both Julian and Vivian, along with a formal referral to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation into attempted poisoning and conspiracy to commit financial fraud through the fraudulent establishment of a guardianship proceeding. The hearing, when it came before a judge just 11 days later given the emergency nature of the filing, unfolded with a swiftness that still surprises me looking back, though it felt, sitting in that courtroom, like the longest hour of my entire life. Julian's attorney attempted, predictably, to characterize the recording as ambiguous, suggesting Vivian's comment about dosage could have referred to any number of innocent medical contexts. Perhaps a sleep aid, perhaps a supplement, and that Alina's, meaning my, deteriorating condition was a genuine and tragic medical mystery rather than evidence of foul play. That argument survived approximately 4 minutes, until Dr. Annan took the stand and walked the court through the hair sample timeline with the same clinical precision she'd shown in her office weeks earlier, explaining, point by point, exactly how thallium exposure correlated with each symptom I had reported, and exactly how the escalating dosage pattern matched an intentional, gradually increasing administration rather than any accidental or environmental exposure. The judge asked her directly whether accidental exposure to this specific pattern was medically plausible. Dr. Anand answered without hesitation. In 31 years of forensic toxicology, I have never seen an accidental exposure pattern that escalates this precisely and consistently over a 10-week period. This pattern reflects deliberate, controlled administration. Julian's attorney had no meaningful response prepared for that testimony, because there wasn't one that fit the story his clients had constructed. Vivian, when called to testify, attempted a version of denial that unraveled almost immediately under Devon's cross-examination. She claimed the recording had captured her discussing an entirely unrelated matter, a conversation about medication dosages for her own arthritis treatment, and insisted the timing of her comments simply happened to coincide unfortunately with unrelated concerns about my health. Devon, calmly, asked her to explain then why she had specifically referenced dosage not appearing on a standard panel, in relation to a conversation supposedly about her own prescribed arthritis medication, which would, of course, already appear clearly on any standard medical record, given that it had been legitimately prescribed by her own physician. Vivian had no answer for that question that didn't further tighten the noose she had, in her own recorded words, quite literally tied around herself. The judge, reviewing the totality of the evidence, the toxicology reports, the recording, the T-sample analysis, and the timeline correlating symptom onset with the beginning of Julian's increased interest in Callaway Textile Group's governance, granted the emergency protective order against both Julian and Vivian, dismissed the guardianship petition entirely with prejudice, and formally referred the entire matter to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. The criminal case moved slower than the civil proceedings, as these matters usually do, but moved with an inevitability that felt, by that point, almost anticlimactic compared to the terror of those first weeks after I discovered what was happening to me. Investigators executing a search warrant on Vivian's house found, in a locked drawer of her writing desk, a small quantity of thallium sulfate along with handwritten notes, discovered later to be in her own handwriting, tracking dosage amounts and dates against my reported symptoms during our weekly dinners. A chilling document that read, according to Devon, almost like a laboratory log, methodical and utterly devoid of any acknowledgement that the subject of the experiment was her own daughter-in-law. The notes also included several references to timeline projections, estimates of how many additional weeks of escalating dosage would likely be required before symptoms became severe enough to support a compelling guardianship petition, evidence that transformed the case from a circumstantial poisoning allegation into something the district attorney's office described, in their formal charging document, as a calculated, long-term conspiracy to defraud through medically engineered incapacitation. Investigators also traced the source of the thallium itself, a detail that added its own quiet horror to the case once it emerged. Vivian had purchased small quantities of an industrial rodenticide formulation, still legally available for agricultural use in certain restricted contexts, through a supplier in a neighboring state, using a shell business she had registered under her late husband's name specifically, investigators believed, to avoid any purchase being traced directly back to her own identity. The supplier, a small chemical distributor with no reason to suspect wrongdoing, had simply processed the order as a routine agricultural pest control purchase, unaware that the woman signing for the delivery had no farm, no agricultural license, and no legitimate use whatsoever for a compound banned from general consumer sale, specifically because of cases exactly like mine. When investigators presented Vivian with the purchase records during a follow-up interview, her attorney advised her to stop answering questions entirely, but not before she reportedly said one sentence that Devin told me still occasionally kept him up at night reviewing the case file. "I would have found another way eventually." Whether that sentence reflected genuine confession or simple defiance, I have never been able to decide, and I have mostly stopped trying. Julian's role, ultimately, proved less directly hands-on than Vivian's, though no less culpable in the eyes of the law or, frankly, in my own heart. Investigators found extensive email correspondence between Julian and the neuropsychiatric specialist he had recommended. Discussions that, read in full rather than the carefully worded fragments he had shared with me, made clear that the referral had never been about genuine concern for my health, but about securing a compliant medical opinion favorable to the guardianship petition in exchange for a substantial consulting fee that would be paid, conveniently, from Callaway Textile Group funds once Julian gained control of the trust. Julian was charged as a co-conspirator in the fraud aspects of the case, though prosecutors ultimately could not establish that he had personally administered the thallium, a distinction that meant Vivian faced considerably more severe charges, including attempted murder, while Julian faced conspiracy and fraud charges that, while serious, carried a different weight entirely. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters more than the satisfaction of watching consequences finally arrive. I did not feel triumphant sitting in that courtroom watching Vivian's composure finally, completely collapse as the search warrant evidence was read into the record. I felt mostly a kind of grief so total it left almost no room for anything else. The grief of understanding that the woman who had reorganized my wedding seating chart twice out of what I once believed was excessive, but genuine care had, for months, been calculating exactly how much poison it would take to convince a judge I no longer deserved control over my own life. I felt the grief of realizing that the man who held my hand during that first inconclusive doctor's appointment had been counting, quietly, on my decline rather than dreading it. Some griefs do not resolve simply because the truth finally arrives to justify them. They just finally have somewhere honest to land. The divorce proceeded alongside the criminal case, uncontested in every meaningful sense once the protective order was in place, since Julian's attorney understood, correctly, that contesting anything related to Callaway Textile Group or the family trust would only invite further scrutiny into exactly how much he had known and when. I retained full and uncontested control of the company, the trust, and the house, none of which had ever been anything but mine to begin with, though the process of legally formalizing that reality felt, after everything, like closing a door that should never have needed a lock in the first place. Rosalind Farrow, my father's old friend and Callaway Textile Group's CEO, visited me during those difficult months more often than I probably deserved given how little useful company I was capable of being, and told me once, over coffee in my kitchen, that my father had trusted her with the company specifically because he believed I had inherited his instinct for recognizing when something didn't quite add up, even when I couldn't yet articulate exactly what was wrong. "You didn't drink that tea the fourth time she offered it," Rosalind said. "That instinct saved your life, Alina, whatever else this year has cost you." My physical recovery took longer than the legal proceedings, months of careful monitoring with Dr. Anand, and a toxicologist she referred me to for ongoing treatment, gradually clearing the thallium from my system through a supervised chelation process that left me exhausted in ways I hadn't expected. Exhausted in a manner that felt, oddly, like grief itself had a physical weight I was slowly metabolizing alongside the poison. The tremors faded first, then the confusion then, much more slowly. The particular fear that had settled into me during those weeks of continuing to accept tea I knew was laced with something meant to unravel my mind. I still, more than a year later, hesitate slightly before accepting a drink prepared by someone else. A small, persistent residue of those months that Dr. Anand tells me may simply be part of how my nervous system processes what happened, a caution that isn't irrational so much as earned. Vivian was ultimately convicted of attempted murder and elder financial abuse statutes that, prosecutors argued successfully, extended to spousal financial exploitation, given the guardianship conspiracy's clear financial motive, and sentenced to 18 years in state prison, a sentence her attorney is still appealing as of this recording, though Devon tells me the appeal has little realistic chance of success given the strength of the physical evidence recovered from her desk. Julian pleaded guilty to conspiracy and fraud charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and his cooperation in testifying against his mother, a decision that split whatever remained of their relationship as completely as his testimony split whatever remained of my capacity to feel anything toward him beyond a distant, exhausted pity. He is currently serving a 4-year sentence and has written to me twice from prison, letters I have not opened, because Marguerite, who reads them first specifically so I don't have to, tells me they contain nothing beyond explanations I no longer have any use for. Marguerite moved in with me for the first 2 months after the criminal case concluded, ostensibly to help me manage the logistics of selling the house, though we both understood the real reason was that neither of us fully trusted me to be alone, yet with what remained of my nervous system's memory of fear. She still calls every Sunday evening, the same day of the week that once meant driving to Vivian's house for dinner, a small, deliberate reclaiming of a day that had belonged, for months, to someone else's calculations. At Callaway Textile Group, the news of what had happened traveled quietly through the company despite our efforts to keep the criminal proceedings separate from daily operations, and I was surprised, in the weeks following Vivian's conviction, by how many employees, people I had met only briefly at company events over the years, sent quiet, thoughtful notes, several of them mentioning that they had noticed I seemed different at the last board dinner before everything became public, tired, unsteady, and had simply assumed, the way people often do, that it wasn't their place to ask. I have thought often about that particular kind of silence since, the well-meaning distance people maintain around someone else's visible decline, and I no longer entirely blame anyone for it, though I have become, in the time since, considerably less willing to extend that same silence toward my own instincts when something feels wrong. I sold the house we shared, not out of financial necessity, but because I found I could no longer walk through rooms where I had once trusted a marriage that had, for months, been quietly calculating the most efficient path toward my legal erasure. I purchased a smaller place upstate, closer to the mill where Callaway Textile Group had begun, and I have, slowly, begun spending more time actually involved in the company's operations, not because I no longer trust Rosalind, but because I discovered, somewhere in the process of nearly losing everything my father built, that I wanted a more active relationship with the thing that had ultimately been the reason someone tried to poison me into irrelevance. There is something strange and clarifying about surviving an attempt to erase you specifically because of what you own and who you are. It leaves you, eventually, less interested in disappearing quietly into anyone else's version of your life ever again. So here is the question I still find myself sitting with, more than a year later, in a house that finally, entirely, belongs only to me. If the people closest to you began treating your decline as a resource to manage rather than a tragedy to prevent, how long do you think it would take you to notice? I would like to believe I noticed quickly, but the truth is it took a poured cup of tea and an overheard sentence through a half-open door before I finally trusted my own instincts over the comfortable story I had been telling myself about the people who loved me. I would love to hear what you would have done in my place, whether you think you would have caught the patterns sooner, or whether, like me, it might have taken hearing the plan spoken aloud before you allowed yourself to believe it. Share your thoughts in the comments, because someone reading them tonight might need permission to trust the tremor in their own hands over the reassurance of someone who benefits from their doubt. This video is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection. All names, characters, and events are fictional. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you enjoy dark, satisfying stories about betrayal, survival, and the quiet strength it takes to trust yourself when no one else will, subscribe to Sweet Vindication, and we'll see you in the next one.